We will now go right into our next session, and we will have another set of patient testimonials on what are current treatments and how much or what can or cannot do. We have Christina, Lindsay, Laura, John, and Jay.
My name is Christina Rusher, and I'm 29. I used to think of myself as a go-getter, but primary sclerosing cholangitis, more often than not, stops me. I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis and PSC when I was 17. I was forced to take a leave of absence from college and ultimately pushed through. I was a passionate public school teacher for 7 years, during which I was in and out of the hospital. I've now approached the reality that the job is too taxing on my health, my body, and my disease. I had to give up yet another identity that I had of myself. Battling this disease and maintaining a life worth living is a full-time job in itself. I'm hospitalized a few times a year, even the week before my wedding. To date, I have had pancreatitis, a cholestectomy, and 18 ERCPs, most of which required anesthesia, long recovery time, and absences from work. Between the pruritus, stent replacements, frequent biliary obstructions, cholangitis, cirrhosis, the heightened risk of cancer, and the impending doom of a liver transplant, I typically have to live in between the highs and the lows. While makeup and positive attitude can hide a lot, I'm itchy, fatigued, and in pain almost every day. As hardships frequently arise, I depend on my family and friends to help me clean my house, attend medical appointments, and take care of my son. My husband's even brushed my hair for me. I'm lucky to have 2 doctors that guide me and that I trust incredibly. My support system keeps me sane and encouraged, as this disease frequently robs me of joyous moments. My need for support grew as I developed cholestasis with extreme itching during my life-threatening pregnancy with my sweet and perfect son. But this was the first experience at what has become one of my most severe PSC symptoms, cholestatic pruritus. This debilitating itch is merciless, all-consuming, and overwhelming. It's everywhere, and worst of all, my feet. I don't even notice when I'm itching anymore, and I find myself rubbing my feet on anything, creating blisters. The pruritus increases in intensity and severity in the heat and at night. When I wake up, I've noticed that I've broken skin and started bleeding from itching subconsciously, creating scars. The itching results in a lack of sleep, making it difficult to function the following day. As current treatments are non-existent, not effective, and have side effects, pruritus has continued to interrupt my life, and I have not found relief. I've tried Vistaril, hydroxyzine, Ursodiol, Welchol, Benadryl, and a multivitamin. The non-pharmacological and alternative approaches I've tried are endless, and they create a financial hardship on my family. I've tried acupuncture, Bowen, humidifiers, cold showers, keeping a clean shave, icing itchy areas, oatmeal lotions, moisturizing soaps, essential oils, mineral water sprays, and I keep my house at 68 degrees. I've monitored changes in diet, stayed hydrated, avoided heat and itchy fabrics, and even purchased lighter, looser fitting clothing and cooling bed sheets. I hope that my perspective can make it clear that despite how minor the symptom of itching looks on paper, suffering from pruritus is beyond description. I feel helpless, and I truly don't want it to become another all-consuming identity for me. Thank you.
I was 15 years old when I woke up from a 3-day coma, and that's when I began to realize the life and death nature of my PSC diagnosis. My name is Lindsay. I'm 24 years old, and I have already had 2 liver transplants because of PSC. I was diagnosed with PSC at age 13, and I was blissfully unaware of the terrifying journey ahead of me. I trusted my doctors to know everything about the disease and to give me a couple of medications to cure me. I had no idea I would be starting high school with end-stage liver failure, and a progressive case of portal hypertension. Despite my illness, I signed up for all the extracurricular activities, marching band, I went on all the school field trips, and it was on one of those field trips far from home that my portal hypertension caused esophageal varices to rupture. Blood had been silently leaking into my stomach all day, and I could not stay awake. My friends thought it was funny until I threw up blood in my best friend's lap. I woke up 3 days later in the local hospital after being flown by helicopter, and for the first time, I heard the words hepatic encephalopathy. The medications they gave me made me feel horrible. Lactulose helps hepatic encephalopathy patients with their memory a little bit, and the cost is never having a solid bowel movement again. The small improvements from the medicine were not worth having to miss out on swim team and marching band practice. After my first transplant, I began to experience a typical PSC symptom that I had been lucky to not experience before: itching. For me, itching was the first sign that a transplant is a treatment, but not a cure for PSC. Some people respond well to transplant, but there are many of us for whom it just doesn't work. I had to have a second transplant for my PSC, and I'm not the only one. My recurrent PSC journey was more symptomatic than my first. I had itching, fatigue, constant fever and chills, and extreme abdominal pain. For the itching, I tried everything, but nothing seemed to work. I did antihistamines, cholestyramine, naltrexone, and more. If you name it, I probably tried it. The silver lining was that I took antidepressants for the itching, which didn't help the itching, but it improved my mood. For the extreme abdominal pain, I was on opioids for 2 years prior to my second transplant, and I did scheduled celiac plexus nerve blocks, which really messed up my college attendance. After my second transplant, I took Dilaudid for the first few weeks, and then after that, I saw a local pain management specialist who put me on a 6-month methadone weaning program. I remember how embarrassing it was to return to college and have to show my roommates how to use the emergency overdose Narcan medication. I'm now 3 years past my second transplant. I finished college and I plan on graduate school. I appear healthy, but I still have symptoms that affect my life every day. Fevers, chills, and fatigue requiring a 2-hour nap most days. I take 31 pills a day, 16 of which are to treat symptoms. Knowing that there are thousands of other PSCers going through this doesn't make me feel better. It breaks my heart. PSC is no joke, and a transplant is no cure. Someday soon, I hope to see a medication that stops or slows the progression of PSC so that we can all live our life to the fullest. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Laura Bradbury. I was diagnosed with PSC in May 2012, and I received a life-saving living donor liver transplant in March 2017. Today I'm going to talk to you about acute cholangitis and sepsis in the context of PSC, which is something that hugely impacted my life during my PSC journey. My experience with cholangitis began 8 years ago, which was roughly a year after my PSC diagnosis. It was already hard enough being a mother of 3 young children, diagnosed with a disease that there was no treatment or cure available. I just had to wait to get sicker in order to hopefully qualify for a liver transplant. For a few weeks before Christmas, I started to experience cholangitis symptoms: right upper quadrant pain, exhaustion, complete lack of appetite. And then I began to spike a fever just before Christmas. I went to the ER twice, and by the second time I went, I was feeling very ill. But both times I was turned away. They tested me for a UTI, and they eventually just concluded that it was that it was just a viral phenomenon. The second time they did send me home with an antibiotic script just to cover their bases. But when I was at the pharmacy filling the script on the way home, I fainted for the first time in my life. And I woke up to the sound of sirens coming in the distance, an ambulance coming to get me. They took me straight to the hospital where they began IV antibiotics right away. And I was diagnosed with acute cholangitis and full-blown sepsis by that point. So unfortunately, my cholangitis and sepsis journey had just begun from that point. From then on until my living donor transplant 5 years later, cholangitis attacks and sepsis became constants in my life. I never knew when they were going to strike, and I struggled with my doctors to find a combination of oral antibiotics to keep them in check. Even taking these antibiotics, I had breakthrough cholangitis attacks all the time. These meant that I would have to go immediately to the nearest hospital and get hooked up to IV antibiotics and treated for cholangitis and sepsis. It became completely unpredictable, and my daughters became scared to come home from school because they were worried they were going to find me on the couch again, just about to go to the hospital, or indeed already at the hospital for a stay of several days. It became impossible to plan anything, and over the years, my health very steadily eroded because of the cholangitis and the sepsis. My husband had to take over all domestic tasks. I could barely keep up with just basic parenting. I had to go on disability, and I could just see that my health was being severely impacted, and I was going very much downhill. So one summer, I was in the hospital with attack after attack, and I basically spent 2 months for one whole summer just hooked up to an IV basically in the hospital. So my low MELD score at the time did not reflect how sick I was. For patients like us with biliary disease, the MELD score is not an even playing field. So I had no other choice but to go for a living donor transplant because I was advised by my doctors that I would never qualify because of my low MELD, despite the fact that cholangitis and sepsis made me very ill indeed, for a deceased organ transplant. And when they did actually do my transplant, my diseased liver was literally oozing with infection and was extremely difficult to extract from my body. I wish the impact of cholangitis and sepsis would be considered in research. And I also wish the MELD system would be altered to take into account the severity of the disease. I asked for standardized guidelines for the frontline medical education. I can report firsthand that life with acute cholangitis and sepsis is hell for the sufferer and for those around them. Thank you.
My name is John Crowley. I'm a father, a husband, a small business owner, and a location scout for film and television. I have a chronic illness called ulcerative colitis and received a living donor liver transplant 13 years ago after being diagnosed with PSC. My colitis started when I was 13. It was a tough time for me, and it wasn't easy for my parents either. I was one of 6, and it was financially hard to deal with. There wasn't a lot of information out there, so we were entered into a clinical trial because my doctor visits and care would be free. Unfortunately, I was on a placebo, so I ended up getting much sicker. Later, I was put on a large supply of prednisone. Now, at the age of 50, I have osteoporosis and osteopenia. As I got into high school, there were more problems, more doctor's offices, visits, and more meds. There was always worry and no cure. Once I became so exhausted I couldn't move. It hit suddenly, so I laid down at the bottom of the stairs, and I now believe this was the beginning of my PSC, but I wasn't diagnosed with this years later. As I got older, I began to realize that without a cure, I felt I was out there on my own. I would seek information and advice from wherever and whomever I could find it. This was life before the internet. I would read books, go to homeopathic healers, see different medical doctors, and talk to friends. I found if I exercised and ate right, my colitis would go away for a little while. I was still taking a lot of medicine, which was bad stuff. At the time, considered high risk, I couldn't find affordable health insurance. I would have a flare, I would go to the hospital, pretend I didn't know what was going on, get treated, be okay for a while, and then I would return when I got sick again. It's a shame that the sickest of us out there are considered high risk and have the hardest time finding a cure. I'd gotten used to this life and was managing. Then in 2003, I was diagnosed with a rare liver disease called PSC, which went on to cause cirrhosis in my liver. After 13 long years, some varices burst into my stomach and I started to bleed. It became time. It was going to happen. I had to get a transplant. There was no other option. As luck would have it, my older brother was willing to donate 60% of his. I was lucky to have this option because most people don't. They get put on the list, which is long, due to the lack of healthy organs and low MELD scores. For people with PSC, the word transplant seems like a light at the end of a really long tunnel. Although mine has gone well, it hasn't been perfect. I've had reoccurring infections, week-long hospitalizations, and now I'm on IV antibiotics at home to try to deal with reoccurring infections. I still take 14 pills every day, and in a COVID world, I'm worried that while I'm taking immune-suppressing meds, I'm almost 4 years later from my surgery, and I always have the fear of PSC returning. The world in general right now is a really tough place. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and we still have the constant need for blood work, keeping up with our meds, doctor's visits, battles with those insurance companies, and our jobs. My doctor is 3 hours away from my hometown. I can deal with the pain and the exhaustion and the way of life, but it's the emotional side effects that take the most work, the stress on the caretakers and the family, our kids, our work, our support systems, and always wondering what's going to be next and how we're going to deal with it. Without a real cure for patients and their families, we can't escape this reality.
My name is Jay, and I'm the father of a young adult who as a teen was diagnosed with PSC, autoimmune hepatitis, and ulcerative colitis. It's been a hell of a ride. First, we learned that our child was diagnosed with a disease that we had never heard of, and in fact, that hardly anybody had heard of. Next, we learned that there's no cure for this disease. On top of that, it turns out that there's no medicines that can be taken either. So what do you do? Well, thank goodness for the internet. It was there that we learned about other people who had experience with PSC, and by meeting with them and talking to them, we learned about other approaches for treatment, including taking medicines that were not designed for use with PSC. In other words, these were off-label medicines. Given the options, we made the decision to try these off-label medicines. It was not an easy decision to make, and I realized that different people will make different decisions based on their own situations and on the information available to them. The two medicines that I'm talking about are Urso and Vancomycin capsules. We've tried them both. It seems like a lot of PSC patients take Urso, and what do we know? Well, it makes a lot of people feel better. It makes some people's blood numbers improve, but it hasn't been shown to improve the clinical course of the disease. We also know that it may not be safe at high doses. I know that Urso is not approved specifically for PSC, but it has been studied a fair amount for use in PSC. Have these studies taken into account how much better it makes people feel? I think that matters, and it matters a lot. A similar story seems to exist for Vancomycin. Like Urso, many users, particularly pediatric patients, have better blood work, sometimes completely normal, and many report feeling much better. Some even report dramatic improvement with a specific brand of Vancomycin. And, like Urso, not everybody responds. It would be great if we could learn who responds to these drugs and who doesn't. Vanco has been approved for short-term use, which I think is measured in weeks. PSCers are taking it long-term, which is measured in years. And we don't know the risks of that. One of the arguments people hear against the use of vancomycin is the risk of VRE. But as far as I know, there aren't any reports of VRE associated with PSC use, and the first pediatric patients began using it over 2 decades ago. It'd be great if there was a way that we could track the use and outcomes of Vanco when used for PSC. You've also heard that the brand matters, so that should be a part of what's tracked. Some doctors are reluctant or even unwilling to prescribe these drugs. Our PSC reality with this unrelenting progressive disease is that we know pretty well what to expect if we do nothing. So even though patients know these drugs are not proven, many are willing to try them, especially because we hear that some PSCers feel better. Even if the disease is going to progress, feeling better matters. For our son, being able to go to work, university, or to hang out with friends matters. When things are bad, it means weeks and weeks of not sleeping, not eating, nausea and vomiting, massive fatigue, and not being able to think clearly. My question to the FDA, is there a way you can help us monitor the safety of long-term drug use like oral Vanco? And is there a way you can help us make sure how a patient feels is accurately measured as part of any new drug development? Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate this opportunity to convey the message.
Thank you, Christina, Lindsay, Laura, John, and Jay, for your messages on the limited options for effective treatment in PSC. To add more voices to some questions about treatment options, PSC Partners board member, Dr. James McMurtry, will present some of the Our Voices survey results. Please go ahead, Dr. McMurtry.
I'd like to thank you all for asking me to speak today, and I'd particularly like to thank the FDA for sponsoring this important seminar. I'd like to thank the researchers, industry, PSC patients and their families, as well as other interested parties for attending this important seminar. This is likely the first and last time that you'll see me as an internet influencer. I'm hopeful, though, that we as a group can influence the direction of PSC research for the next few years to come. This first slide dovetails with the pediatric session that you had seen earlier this morning. You'll note that 53% of the patients are taking urso and 7% of patients are taking vancomycin in our survey. This in spite of the fact that there is no FDA-approved medication for PSC. PSC patients have reported that they feel better clinically and also have improved liver function studies on both urso and vancomycin. There is clearly need for further research with a large, diverse patient population for adults and pediatrics. There is currently a randomized clinical trial recruiting to study the efficacy of oral vancomycin in adults with PSC. On the next slide, we review the impact of pruritus. Pruritus is one of the most disturbing symptoms for PSCers. This slide shows the impact of pruritus on how PSCers feel and function. Comparing the impact over the last 6 months when it was at its worst. Combining the red and blue bars, we see that 54% of PSCers have mild to severe itching. When pruritus is its worst, as seen in the red section of the lower bar, the impact is tremendous, with 75% affected and close to 50% severely impacted. Pruritus can be ever present for some, or it may wax and wane. Current treatments carry many burdensome side effects. On the next slide, we review the use of medications. The survey question asked, are you currently taking any of these medications for PSC symptoms? This is a snapshot of the type of PSC medications that patients are currently taking. Focusing again on pruritus, we can see that the second bar, over 20% of patients are currently taking a medication for pruritus, in spite of the fact that in the previous slide, we had seen that over 50% of PSC patients have had itching in the past 6 months. Questions to be answered. Is this disparity because the treatment options are not effective, or do they have unacceptable side effects? Given the enormous impact of itching on the quality of life, we are encouraged that currently there are clinical trials focused on improving treatment options. On the last slide for this session, the question was asked, as new medications or treatments develop, what is the most important to you? This is one of the key questions of our Voices survey. Much of what we've heard today is how hard it is to live with PSC symptoms. And what we've also heard PSC patients worry about their uncertain futures. You may be a bit surprised by the responses to this question. We see the overwhelming majority chose as important treatments to slow the progression of PSC. Surprisingly, both adult and PSA patients worry more about cholangiocarcinoma than treating symptoms. We clearly need to find better methods for early diagnosis and treatment of cholangiocarcinoma. This ends my portion of the session, and with this, I'll turn this back over to the moderator. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. McMurtry. Let's go now to the live polling for a few questions about current treatment options. Again, please participate in the polling only if you are a PSC patient or caregiver. To get to the polling, return to the polling tab if you have it open, or to launch the page, go to the green button at the bottom of the page under the window viewer and click on the live polling button. This will open a new tab in your browser, or pick up your phone and go directly to pollev.com/PSC PFDD. All right, our first question. If you have tried pruritus, itching, medications, how well did they work? Select one. A, they were very effective. B, they were moderately effective. C, they were rarely effective. D, they were never effective. E, I have never tried medications for pruritus.
I think the first thing that pops up, isn't it, that we have no one that says they were very effective.
Yep, 0. And interestingly, almost 60% have never tried medications for pruritus, and yet we hear so much from patients how debilitating it is. 15% said they were moderately effective. Okay, next slide, please. Please select the 2 symptoms that you would most like an effective treatment for. Select up to 2. A, pruritus. B, PSC fatigue. C, abdominal or liver pain. D, PSC insomnia. E, nausea, vomiting. Or F, brain fog. Not surprisingly, from what we've heard so far today, pruritus and PSC fatigue are the top 2, with 39% of the respondents saying pruritus and another 30% saying fatigue. Brain fog and abdominal or liver pain also. Mm-hmm. And there are some patients for whom their top 2 would include insomnia and nausea and vomiting.
Right.
Okay, thank you so much. We have another live panel queued up to discuss the reality of current treatments for PSC. And again, I invite the attendants to please send in your comments or call in if you'd like to speak. The number is 703-844-3231.
Thank you, Mary. And welcome to our panel on current treatments. We have Fred, Rachel, Carrie, and Dr. Gupta. Carrie, we will start with you. You're the one calling in from the furthest away. You're in Australia. Tell us a little bit about yourself and why you are on this panel today.
Hi, thank you very much, Veronica. Yes, I am calling in from Australia, so it's I think it's almost 6 o'clock in the morning now here. I've been up watching some of the panel, which has been really good. My association, I guess, with PSC is around my daughter, Beck, who is now a beautiful young adult, but she got sick when she was 5 months old. and was diagnosed with PSC just before her first birthday. She went on to be diagnosed with ulcerative colitis by 8 and very quickly went on to have a colectomy following that diagnosis. And then she had her transplant when she was 13. All of that history and background has prompted me to change my path in my nursing career. I'm now an inflammatory bowel disease nurse as well. And I'm also the founder and president of PSC Support Australia, which we've now been running for a couple of years.
Why do you think that some people with PSC are so desperate that they will try medications even or treatments even if they haven't really been studied?
I think that desperation causes you just to reach out, and watching people deteriorate. As a parent watching my young child deteriorate, we went through many years of that wait and see, we'll try something, wait and see, but there was nothing conclusive. There was nothing that we could say, let's give her this and let's go on with it. I think back to when she was diagnosed with her ulcerative colitis, and again, quickly progress to a colectomy because biologics weren't around then. We didn't have all those, the infliximab and vedolizumab wasn't heard of, and all of those wonderful drugs that we've got now that give a bit of medical hope, they weren't there. So she very quickly progressed. Well, PSC is still in that same scope, I guess, as well. So we want to try something. You'll try something that's off-label, that isn't proven. I think when we look at trying things, when we do it with a health literacy that looks at the safety of things, it's still a good thing to do. But the worry is that people will try things that maybe aren't safe. They haven't looked at it. But, as I say, when we do it with a safety and looking at it from that point of view, that can actually send us on a discovery path of finding a new treatment that can give us ideas, give us options that, might prove to be beneficial for others as well in the longer term.
Right. So what's very important to understand, isn't it, from the patient's voice perspective, that an individual's perception of benefit and risk may be different from someone else's when you are the one that really understands the risks and the hazards of this disease.
Yeah, definitely. And, having conversations with patients from a nursing perspective, even about the risks and the benefits, but having a heart that understands what those benefits are, what the possibility, and having a medical hope or a surgical hope that, that you can actually access before you get to a transplant stage. That's getting to transplant it was a relief for us, for Beck, when we were told she was going to be listed, because she was so sick and had been so sick for so long. But she got sicker. I honestly didn't know what sick was until I saw her those months before transplant when she was in hospital. The treatments we were using weren't about trying to prolong or trying to treat symptoms or manage symptoms. They were keeping her alive. They were literally just life-sustaining treatments. And I think to have a hope, to have something that we can use before you get to that point would be amazing, really.
Right. Thank you, Carrie. Lalit, Dr. Gupta, what is your hope and dream and ambition for finding treatments for PSC?
I totally agree. Let me just introduce myself quickly.
Please.
I am a caregiver. I'm Lalit Gupta. I'm a physician and we live in Washington, D.C. Our daughter has had 2 liver transplants. She had her first liver transplant at age 25 because of PSC. And a few years later, the PSC reoccurred. And she had terrible time before first transplant, and she had terrible time the next 10 years after her first transplant doing that. But fortunately, she had her second liver transplant in 2017. So I'm here as a caregiver, but gone through the whole process. And I totally sympathize with everybody who had mentioned the symptom control, and they're talking about the quality of life and pruritus and recurrent cholangitis and the brain fog. And I get it, because it's totally life kind of this miserable life with that. But I feel that we need to go deeper than that. And most everybody mentioned that, and just Carrie just mentioned that before we get to the transplant, we should have something. And I think we need to request and implore FDA, the pharmaceutical company, the medical community, to please work on trying to find a medical cure for that. I remember in early 80s when I started medical practice, the HIV had just come around, and we had no idea. We had no idea what's going on. But all over the world, everybody got concentrated and worked so hard. In a few years, we knew exactly what was causing it, and we found a treatment, and now it can be cured. I would hope to see the same concentrated effort for this disease. This is a rare disease. This is not affecting such a large community, but you can see the presentation, how many young people, how many productive members of the family, of the society are being affected by it. And if there is an effort for a cure, a medical cure for it, that will be a tremendous benefit to the society, besides the families like us. So that would be my very humble request, and I would strongly suggest and work on that. And PSC Partners have a big registry, and they can provide all the research participants for the people who are wanting to research, but we need some action on the part of the research community.
Right, so really understanding the pathophysiology to be able to translate, in other words, the translational medicine piece to really get at the drugs that we need.
Yes, we are trying Vancomycin, we're trying different things. We are trying, but we still don't know why it is, what is going on. So yes, we should try all those things, but if we can try to get an idea of what is going on, that will go a long way. It's a mysterious disease. What's its association with ulcerative colitis? Why only some people after transplant get a recurrence, others don't get it? What protects them? And what's going on here? Why it waxes and wanes? There's so many tantalizing signs in this disease, which nobody understands.
Thank you, Dr. Gupta. Fred, let me come to you. You are a good friend of PSC Partners and of the forum too. Tell us about yourself. You need to unmute yourself.
Thank you. My name is Fred Sabrick. I am from just outside of Atlanta, Georgia. I was diagnosed with PSC in 2004 and had a relatively mild course of the disease. However, I did need to have the surgical treatment of a transplant in 2012. And since that surgical treatment, I have had all sorts of complications.
Tell us about the complications.
Okay. So first of all, prior to getting PSC, I had maybe, you could count on one hand the number of days I'd been ill in my life. No other conditions, no other comorbidities, anything like that. PSC was the only thing that was wrong with me. And when I did finally get transplanted, I recovered extremely quickly. The optimism was there. You know, I was going to have a great post-transplant experience. And 5 months after transplant, I ran my first half marathon.
Wow.
And, you know, felt like I could beat the world at that point. But those salad days didn't last long. Within 6 months of my transplant, first thing that happened to me was I had a complication where the surgical connection made between my bile duct and my small intestine narrowed. And I had my first ever cholangitis attack as a result of that. And I didn't even know what it was. So that got me hospitalized for about 4 or 5 days. And then I wore a biliary tube for another, I guess it was 8 months or so. But I still was able to get around and do the things that I needed to do, right? And I wanted to do. In fact, I went to a PSC conference with the biliary tube. So that was an experience. But then just a couple of months later, I had a surgical adhesion, bile blockage, and just an immensely painful experience. another surgery, 6 weeks in the hospital, and recovery time at home. And this is while I still had the bile duct tube. But the worst thing that's probably happened to me since transplant is I got the recurrent PSC diagnosis. And that is just a kick below the belt when you're thinking that, okay, I've got these short-term issues and maybe I'll be able to get through those and back to that really, really happy part. Didn't happen. Now you've got the anxiety weighing over your head constantly of how is this going to progress, right? Is it going to be like the first time? Is it going to be different? What am I going to see? Well, in my case, what I've seen are a whole bunch of conditions that were caused by that surgical transplant treatment that I'm 100% sure I would not have had I not had the PSC and then the transplant. And those include lymphoma, which I have now had twice, and I'm actually currently in a clinical trial for treatment of this second occurrence. I've had leukemia that was directly related back to the transplant. I've had just an absolute nightmare with Epstein-Barr virus, and when you're immunosuppressed, it just runs wild inside your body. And so, because of the transplant, because of the immunosuppression, because of the body, reacting and working hard just to keep the current liver sustained, these other conditions are just that much more difficult to deal with. It's like fighting with one hand tied behind your back.
Right.
And I was mentioned earlier that, I was really healthy before transplant. I actually had 3 days in the hospital as a result of a biopsy complication, but that was the only times I'd ever been in the hospital. Prior to that, I've got 120 plus days and counting right now. And, most recently, just in August, 2 more weeks. So my life is, there's no certainty in my life. I'm playing a big game show where behind door number 1, there's lymphoma, and behind door number 2, there's leukemia, and behind door number 3, there's recurrent PSC. So, I don't know what the next day holds. It's that difficult at the moment.
We will work together to find a door number 4 where there will be a treatment behind that door.
I like the sound of that. And, no one should have to go through this, right? I mean, as Lalit mentioned, we really got to have medical treatments for this. And it's because of that surgical treatment that I'm dealing with all these conditions now. And, my former really, really fantastic health is no more.
Fred, thank you. Rachel, we're going to come back to you in a minute and talk with you about the registry that Dr. Gupta already mentioned. But I would like to take one caller to bring in between. We have Laura from Victoria, BC, who would like to talk to us about biopsy issues and clinical trials. Laura, are you with us?
Yes, do you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, I just wanted to speak quickly to the requirement that many clinical trials have for the patients participating in the trial to undergo biopsies. I'm a very active participant on all the PSC forums and in the PSC community. And what I see is that the requirement for biopsies is hugely dissuasive for participation in trials. And for one thing, I'm not sure that biopsies are medically inform the researchers, give them that much information, because PSC by nature presents in a very patchy way in the liver, and a biopsy taken from one area could show nothing and just be right beside the area that is showing something. And also for PSC patients, many of us have gone through biopsies, and they're a very invasive procedure. Like Fred was saying, he was hospitalized for 3 days with a complication. I just had a biopsy in August. I bled internally and was hospitalized for extra time as well. They're very high risk, and they're very unpleasant, and they do bring a lot of potential complications with them. So I would like the FDA and researchers to maybe think about waiving this requirement for biopsies in trials and considering if there's some other methods that they could use.
Absolutely. Thank you, Laura. That is such an important comment that you're making. This is definitely on the top of many people's list in terms of feasibility and participation in clinical trials. Do you have a few comments for us to read? And then we will go to Rachel.
Yes, in fact, Mark from Virginia just wrote in also about biopsy. And he says, biopsies may be a potential impediment to participating in future trials. My first drug trial involved 3 liver biopsies, and my current drug trial involves 2 biopsies. I would like researchers to consider the correlation between all my diagnostic tests showing consistent results between biopsy, FibroScan, blood work, and MRCP, eliminating the need for additional biopsies.
Very good. Any more comments?
Yes, sure, we can do a few. Francis from Connecticut, spouse of a deceased patient, says, my husband passed away on August 16th, 2020 from PSC Crohn's. Ed battled this disease undiagnosed until he presented with stage 3 cirrhosis in 2015. Life would have been so much easier for Ed if the disease had been known more widely and if there had been a drug that would have given him a longer life.
Let's do one more.
Okay, Verpi from Finland wrote in about the lack of psychological support. In Finland, we are lacking mental and psychological support. What we need is more interest in finding a cure or at least more effective medication.
Thank you. These are all such important comments. We will now go to Rachel. Rachel Gomel is joining us from Montreal. And you have a lot to tell us about the PSC Partners Registry.
Thank you, Dr. Miller and Mary. I'm Rachel Gomel. I'm the Registry Director at PSC Partners. I do live in Montreal, Canada, and my heart also lives in the US, which is home to my 3 children and to PSC Partners. Before PSC struck my family, I was an academic focused on my doctoral research. I moved from being a researcher to working as full-time volunteer for PSC Partners for the past 13 years. One of my projects was to develop, launch, and direct the PSC Partners Registry.
You have some updates to tell us about.
Yes. Well, 6 years ago, we launched the registry, which was the outcome of years of work with the NIH, the Global Registry Pilot Program. Today, the registry holds the data of 1,700 PSC patients, and it keeps growing. It's annually reviewed by an IRB, and our team is HIPAA trained to protect the privacy of our participants. We just launched an upgrade with new features that we're very excited about. The registry can now house multiple surveys and has improved features to track longitudinal data. Another exciting feature is the upcoming researcher portal that will give de-identified and data access to screened and approved researchers. Well, to make it easier on patients, we've made the registry mobile friendly, and data can be entered directly from the phone or tablet.
That is wonderful. How do you think, Rachel, that this registry will support new drug development for PSC?
PSC Partners considers the registry a crucial voice of the patient. Each patient's participation is a vote for research, a confirmation of the patient's commitment to taking part in clinical trials and studies. We're working with academic researchers and industry. We're providing them with patient input for their clinical trial protocols. We identify aspects of the trial that might make patient participation difficult. Our aim is to make trials easy for patients to join. We've seen how involving the patient voice too late in the process has led to simple errors that negatively affect trial outcome. Well, we've also disseminated surveys to our participants to help researchers design their trials. Data for our Voices survey today partly came from the registry. We've also helped in recruiting for trials and studies. At this stage, we'd love nothing more than to recruit for more trials.
That would be so wonderful. What if you had 20 trials to recruit for?
That would be fabulous.
Right. We heard earlier, at the very beginning of today's forum, from Dr. Ruby Mehta at the FDA, and she described how the patient's voice is so important across the whole journey before a protocol gets written, during the writing of the protocol, having input into what's acceptable to patients. And for example, today we heard if there's something else that could be done rather than a biopsy, that would be so helpful. And that's very important information for everyone to have regarding what it means to a patient to have to undergo these very invasive, painful, and risky procedures. So it's very nice that this registry, the way you describe it, is really part of that patient voice input from the very beginning to the very end.
Right. Well, and for the future, we just hope that, we see the registry as an infrastructure, a data collection tool, and we can absorb new functions as needed. We understand the importance of having standardized and approved patient-reported outcome tools. We also know that PSC needs a natural history database that can serve as external control in the later phases of clinical trials. Well, our goal is to facilitate and expedite such efforts through the registry and continue to support clinical trials.
Right. So when you first started the registry, it was an idea and you just implemented it, you went ahead with it, and look how far you have come. Congratulations on those efforts. Let's talk a little bit about vancomycin. We have one caller wanting to tell us a little bit about that experience. We have Jennifer from Tennessee. Are you ready to talk?
Hello, yes, I am.
Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, thank you guys for allowing me to speak. My name is Jenna Ziegler. I'm 26 years old, and I've been living with PSC since 2017.
Thank you.
And I'd like to share my experience using the off-label drug, Vancomycin, and share my plea for the FDA to fund research on this promising existing therapy that saved my life and the lives of others. These past 3 years, I've been actually virtually pain-free with normal labs, no complications, infections, or disease progression. And as we've heard today, while many others are preparing for liver transplant or experiencing intense symptoms, I am so thankful to be the healthiest I've ever been. Unfortunately, vancomycin is often discounted because of its many nuances. Dr. Kenneth Cox at Stanford has identified at least 5 factors that affect Vanco's efficacy, including brand and dose. And 2 capsule brands have been shown to return elevated liver enzymes to normal, halt fibrosis, and even potentially eliminate the need for liver transplant, while 5 oral brands have no effect. And in 2018, my pharmacy accidentally ordered me one of those 5 brands, and swallowing those pills was detrimental to my health. It started a year-long flare that put me in the hospital and even forced me to drop out of postgraduate school.
Jennifer, that sounds like an amazing experience that you've had with Vanco, and it gets into all kinds of issues about the different versions and generics, etc., that are not always, the drugs are not always exactly the same, as you have discovered. But it's very good to hear about that from you, and thank you for calling in and making that comment. We have 1 minute left, and I would just like to do a quick round with the panel. Fred, would you encourage patients to participate in clinical trials?
Absolutely. I think if for no other reason than just to have that feeling in your head that I'm helping, I'm doing something to advance the cause, to make some progress. It's better than standing still.
Thank you. Carrie? Would you encourage patients to participate?
100%, I would. Even going on from what Fred has said, it gives a patient access to experts and people who are keen in that specific field. So people who are really wanting to work with PSC, these are the people that are running at the clinical trials centre at the coalface. So yeah, expert care you'll get.
We're just running out of time, so very quickly, Dr. Gupta and Rachel, hands up or down? Clinical trials, up, thumbs up, thumbs up. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, all of you. And I'm so sorry we're out of time, but this has been another very informative session. So thank you, Fred, Rachel, Carrie, and Dr. Gupta. We will see you soon in person, I hope. Have a very good rest of the day. Bye-bye.